You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo first looked at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Writers have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, an award-winning filmmaker, self-professed book nerd, and creator of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. This podcast is for anyone who loves books, loves authors, loves France, or any combination therein. Each week, I'll speak with an author whose life, stories, or characters have a connection to France. Then these amoureux de livres will treat us to a reading from their book. I'm very excited to welcome back this week's guest, Helen Fripp. Helen first graced us with her presence in our 32nd episode, where we spoke about her novel, The Painter's Girl. Her latest novel finds us returning to France, this time in Provence during World War II, in The Girl from Provence. The Girl from Provence has everything: war, intrigue, and romance. Even Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, plays an important role. So, please allow me to reintroduce Helen Fripp, author of The Girl from Provence. Hello, Helen. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Hi. Well, it's lovely to be here and vicariously in Paris as well.
We are having a very cold, wet, rainy day, so you don't get too excited.
Okay, I'm not too jealous then.
You're not missing much, no. So you are, I think in our 70 episodes, I think you are the first repeat author to come back on the show. So thank you for coming back. I appreciate it. And can you remind our listeners who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I'm Helen Fripp and I'm an author. I've now written 3 books and they've all been set in France. The first one was The French House, which was about Veuve Clicquot, the champagne widow who became an international kind of superstar. The second one was about the Impressionists in Paris. And then the third one is the book we're going to talk about today, The Girl from Provence, which is set in World War II in the south of France.
So this, as you mentioned, is your third historical fiction set in France. What is it about French history that keeps drawing you back?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I went on a French exchange when I was 13 and I was so shy that I didn't speak a word. And in those days, they literally just chucked you in a French family, said goodbye, and you had to kind of fend for yourself. And I got home after the 3 weeks and my mum said, you must call and say thank you to the family. So I did. And I opened my mouth and all this French came out. I couldn't believe it. Somehow it had just gone in. And so after that, we made friends with the family. I went and spent all my school holidays with this family. They had a house in the south of France. It was idyllic. And so I just fell in love with France. And then at the same time, I was a bit rubbish at school. I didn't work nearly hard enough. I drove my teachers mad. But I remember my history teacher in frustration gave me a historical novel to read. And I just thought it was the most amazing thing that I had ever read. So I look back at those 2 sort of fairly small parts of my upbringing and I think culminated in this love of France and this love of history. And I then went and spent a little time with my family and we lived in a fishing village in the south called Collioure. And the children went to the local primary school. So I've always been drawn back to France. And somehow writing about France gives me a bit more freedom. It seems like another place that I can enjoy being in and experimenting in.
I visited Collioure last year. It's beautiful there. How lucky to have lived there.
Well, this was pre-Brexit and we literally, on a whim, I think my children were about 5 and 7. We went on holiday, passed through Collioure for one night and thought, this would be a nice place to come and live. Looked up some kind of holiday rentals, asked if anyone was up for renting out to us for a little while, went to primary school and said, could our children come here for a year? And the headmaster said, it's 10 to 12. If you run to the Mary now, you can sign up. So we literally, the four of us ran to the Mary, signed up, and this was in the October. And we were there. The children were in the local school in the January. And we had the most amazing time. And you're right, it's the most beautiful place.
What an incredible story. And how magical for your kids. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I think it wasn't all plain sailing for them. We had a great time, but they had to go to a school where they didn't speak French. So I think that was a bit of a learning curve for them, but they both came out speaking fluently. So yeah, it was an amazing experience.
Wow. All right. So let's talk about The Girl from Provence. What is the story about?
So it's set in the south of France in 1942. And my heroine, Lilou, is a beekeeper. She lives on a small holding in the wilds of Provence, and she just imagines that the war will never reach them. And of course it does. And so through a series of events, her Jewish friend is taken, her brother is sort of conscripted into I can't remember what it's called, actually. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, he was conscripted into the scheme where they took young men of working age and sent them to work in Germany. And so she's drawn to the resistance, and then the story unfolds.
Fabulous. So I want to get one big thing out of the way first. So when I approached you to come back on the podcast to talk about The Girl from Provence, I mentioned that I had some reservations, namely with this central love story between Lilou, who is a French resistance fighter, and Kristian, who is a German Nazi who was sort of conscripted against his will.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a little bit about why you chose the storyline?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I certainly haven't sugarcoated the brutality and the prejudices committed by the Germans. And there are multiple scenes in my book that convey that very thing. And in fact, I think most people would agree. I felt sick writing them, but I felt it was important to have them in there. But in a nutshell, he's a young conscript. He never wanted to go to war. He doesn't believe in the Nazi cause, and I make that very clear. And the war was cruel to both sides. Not all Germans were just bad or agreed with what the Nazis were doing. And he, again, I make it clear his motivations. He does his best to the people who he's meant to be attacking. And so he puts himself at risk. And in the love affair, he proves himself to Lilou, who's very suspicious at first. And of course, it's a very dangerous thing to have any kind of relationship with a German soldier. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I felt like it was fair and a kind of a reasonable perspective within the chaos of war. But of course, if every soldier and every conscript said no, there would be no war. But we all know it's not quite as simple as that, although one of the characters in my book, a young boy, a small Jewish boy, Elliot, who we find clutching a copy of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, sees it much more simply and just doesn't understand why there should be war, and sees it very much through a child's point of view. And I think that's interesting as well, because no one has to go to war. It's simple, really, or it should be.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. And I want to be completely clear and explicit. In no way do I think that you're confused, like wishy-washy or anything. I have complete clarity on where you stand on this. It's not like I think you're sugarcoating what the Nazis did in any way at all. I think from my perspective, just by nature of doing a podcast about books that have a tie to France, I've ended up reading a lot of books that are set in World War II. So this isn't really even so much exactly about you, but I have the platform here and I know you are coming on. And so I thought I would take the chance to talk about it. One of the difficulties that I have is that there are so many books with French resistance fighters, and it makes it seem like there were so many, but it was really just like 2% of the population. And the worry becomes that if every book features someone in the French resistance, it makes it seem like there were so many French people who were fighting against the Nazis, who were subversive, and that really wasn't the case. And then I know on the other side that there were German soldiers who were not Nazi sympathizers, who were there not of their own free will. But it also worries me on a larger global context, with the world being what it is and me being an American and seeing what's happening in the world back there, I worry that if we whitewash a little bit too much what happened or maybe romanticize what was truly a tragic time, that it gives a false narrative and makes everything a little bit softer than what it was. And so I really just was interested in whether you felt any of that gravity while you were writing.
I absolutely did. I felt it was such a responsibility to be writing about World War II. And although we all know sort of broadly what happened, when you read all the accounts and when you find out the depth of the cruelty, it's just, just unbelievable. And I was really determined that I was going to, make sure that that was included. And you're absolutely right about the resistance as well. Most people weren't necessarily collaborators, but they certainly didn't do anything. And also, I make it very clear in the book that, if you did join the resistance, you were very likely going to be tortured and die. So most people weren't brave enough. And also, when I was researching sort of amongst French people, the first thing they all said to me was, "We don't judge," because the majority of people didn't do anything. And we need to recognise this. I totally agree with you, and apply that to now. I mean, all the wars that are happening now. So I totally agree. And I hope that readers would agree that I have handled this with sensitivity. It's something that my editor and I discussed a lot. And it was just the most horrible period. And I totally agree with you about romanticising it. But the fact is, people did still have relationships. They still fell in love. People are human.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your candor and your openness in talking about this. It's a difficult subject. So I appreciate you engaging with me in this way. And also, I'm happy to know how much you thought about it. And it is reflective in your book. I don't mean to imply otherwise. So now let's get to the fun stuff. You mentioned before that, well, this book has some guest appearances by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the writer of The Little Prince. And actually, he's pretty integral to the plot. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did there and how much of that storyline was true?
Well, I researched Antoine de Saint-Exupéry a lot and totally fell in love with him. What an amazing character he was. So brave, so dashing, so talented. And the way that he wrote about flying was so beautiful. The kind of broad context of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry being a reconnaissance pilot is true, but his involvement in the plot is totally my own invention. So I hope I've conveyed the spirit of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And without giving a plot spoiler, his manuscript, or a version of his manuscript, is involved as well. And of course, there's this little Jewish boy who's integral to the plot, who is found clutching a copy of The Little Prince, and it's his world that he escapes into. So we hear a little bit of a sort of interpretation of The Little Prince through his eyes as well.
I loved all of that. And we won't get too much into it because I definitely don't want to give anything away, but I loved everything that you did there. And I wondered, your writing style is always lovely. You write beautiful descriptive passages. And this book has like a lightness. I don't think whimsy is the right word, but there's sort of like a lightheartedness or a youthfulness. Anyway, there's something in it that reminded me of the writing style of The Little Prince. I feel like there is an echo of it in there somewhere. Was your book influenced by the writing style of The Little Prince?
Inspired by, I would say. And certainly when I talk about Saint-Exupéry flying, I obviously never use any of his words, but it was certainly inspired by the way he spoke about it. And actually, I hate flying. I hate being so high up. I never trust the plane. But he just made it seem so kind of lyrical and beautiful. And those little old mail planes that he used to fly, kind of low over the fields, watching the orange trees and the rivers kind of scything through the landscape, make it seem kind of really exciting again. Although probably in reality, I'd feel even worse in one of those planes because they were literally glued together, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be absolutely terrifying. He writes about it or you write about him describing it very romantically, but I'm sure it would be terrifying. I don't think I would enjoy it at all.
No, me neither.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may also enjoy my podcast, City of Muses. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists and creatives to explore what inspires them, where their creativity comes from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. And I know that I said before there weren't that many resistance fighters, but Marie-Madeleine Fourcade makes an appearance in this book. She was a real person, and it seems like she was a pretty extraordinary one. Can you talk to us a little bit about her and what drew you to her storyline?
Yeah, she was a major inspiration for the book. And of course, she was one of the few female resistance leaders. There were plenty of females in the ranks, but she was one of the kind of major figures. And she was incredibly brave. She was incredibly resourceful. And by all accounts, I read up a lot about her. She had an amazing memory. She had a facility for inspiring the ranks and also for really the business of what the resistance were doing. And that was kind of passing on information, retaining information. And she had so many near escapes. And there's one scene, well, no, I don't want to give it away, but there was all sorts of stories which aren't all in the book, but one of them where she spent 8 hours in someone's boot with a mail bag and her hip dislocated and she kind of walked away from that. She was an extraordinary person. And before that, she had been sort of a rather a bored society hostess. And I think that's one of the main themes of my book is like how ordinary people find it within themselves to step up and be so brave in the face of such brutality.
Yeah, that was one of the parts that really drew me in, especially because she seems larger than life. And it even seems like one of those characters where, truth is stranger than fiction. And if you had put everything in about her life, probably we would have been like, this is too fantastical.
Yes. And I think what I realized, because I read up a lot around this subject, is sort of war is so chaotic that in a way everything's possible. Everything happened. It was so uncontrollable. And so there were these people who, obviously you're going to hear, I guess, more about the people who succeeded, but they did, many people did succeed against all the odds. And you like to hope that maybe, it was a triumph of good over evil in some cases.
Yes. And we hope that continues.
Yes, absolutely.
So one of the other central characters in this book that you mentioned before is Elliot, a 7-year-old boy. Were there particular challenges in writing someone so young? Did you hesitate on whether you would have him at 7?
Yeah, I thought a lot about his age because he had to be able to say certain things, but I didn't want it to seem inauthentic. So, yes, it was difficult having a child, and it was difficult having a child in that situation as well, writing about this frightened little child and putting him in some of the situations he ended up in were difficult. But he had this sort of knowing way about him. And really, as well, through him, I wanted to say what we all think. Why are we doing this? Surely it's just so simple to stop. And so it was good to have a child's perspective from that point of view. And you would have to hope that everybody or most people would resonate with what he thinks.
Yeah, he's a lovely character, and you treat him with real sensitivity too, because he's gone through a lot of traumas in his own situation. So it's not like he's this precocious 7-year-old who's like, I know what's true and what isn't. He's obviously been through a lot, and there are definite echoes of the Little Prince in him, I see as well.
Yes, he takes a lot of solace in the book and imagines himself living in space and escaping into this safer world. So absolutely there are echoes, and this sort of universal truth that the children can kind of tell us what we should already know.
Mm. And there are many love stories in this book, but my favorite love story is the love story between Elliot and Scout, the sheepdog.
Yeah, I spent some time in the foothills of the Alps researching the book and came across these Patu, these Pyrenean mountain dogs, these enormous things that spent the summers up in the hills on their own with the sheep. And so that kind of sparked the idea of him protecting Elliot. And so they become great friends. And when Elliot first comes into the story, he's so traumatized, he can't speak. He can only speak through the dog. And the dog replies with a series of kind of eye movements or barks or just kind of lies down and can't really be bothered with everything. And Elliot adores him and he adores Elliot.
A very natural relationship, makes a lot of sense, and it's heartwarming too to read. And there are a number of important animals in the story, not just Scout the dog, but also bees. How much did you know about bees and beekeeping before you started writing?
Very little. I just always loved the idea of beekeeping, and I'd read a few poems about bees, and I found this amazing piece of work by Maeterlinck, who was a scientist but also a writer who studied bees in the 19th century and wrote so beautifully about them. And so I quite often, when I'm thinking about how I'm going to get into a book and how I'm going to get into a character, it's things like that that really help you to get into it. There's something kind of lyrical about the life of bees, and also this idea of this kind of altruistic life that they live. Everything is done for the good of the hive. And also, most of my books concentrate on female heroines, and obviously bees are mainly female, or most of the work is done by the bees. So I just loved the idea of that. And obviously that kind of played into being in Provence and the lavender fields and all the rest of it. So I really enjoyed researching all of that. And I actually wanted to go on a beekeeping course, but hadn't realised in my ignorance that I could only really do that in the spring. And by the time I was going to do that, it was winter and nothing much happens then. So I did a lot of reading and watching videos, and I'm following all these amazing people who go and rescue these swarms from car boots and all sorts of places.
I wondered if you'd actually gone on a beehiving course or been to bee fields? I don't know how you say that, but if you'd been there in person, because the way you write about it seems so realistic and so authentic.
Thank you so much. No, I just a subject that I love. And so there's a lot out there that you can kind of watch and read. And that's what I did. And then translated it into the book.
One of the other parts that I love so much about this book is everything with the night sky and the stars and the cosmos. Where did those ideas come from? And did you know how integral they would be to the plot when you started?
No, I didn't. I was interested in this idea. I talk about Lilou meets Lysander flights, and Lysanders were little aircraft who flew by the light of the moon. They didn't have any light, so that they couldn't be detected. And so they could only fly on the full moon. And obviously it needed to be a clear sky as well. So it started with that. I was imagining Lilou, who's quite a country person, understanding, all the cycles of the moon and, with sheep, and having been involved with shepherds who were always watching the night skies. So, and then I thought about the Little Prince, and it all kind of started coming together. And then one of the major plot points ends up being to do with astronomy as well. And that came much later, but it just all kind of made itself known to me, I suppose.
Very interesting. Where did the idea start? There are so many different parts that have come together. Did it start with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry? Did it start with Marie Madeleine? Did it start with Provence? Where was the genesis? Where was the jumping off point?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to write a World War II novel. And actually, my husband works in documentary film, and he came to me and said, I've got the most amazing story for you. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry disappeared in 1944 on a reconnaissance trip on behalf of the French RAF, and they couldn't trace him. They couldn't find anything out about where he'd gone. And then they found his identity bracelet in a bay off Marseille in the early 1990s. And so at the same time, a German Luftwaffe pilot put two and two together with the timings and was absolutely positive it was him who had shot down this plane with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in it. So that sparked it, because apparently he was absolutely devastated because The Little Prince was his favourite childhood book. So I kind of had this idea around this, and then it ended up being something completely different. But that's what sparked it, this idea that, you know, a series of events would kind of culminate in this point. And then I started researching and found out about Marie-Madeleine Forçade. And then actually in a little village where I was, I also found out about my rebel priest, who had a radio in his clock tower and was incredibly brave and supported the resistance in the local area.
That is fascinating to me, because when I was reading your book, I thought that the part where Saint-Exupéry is shot down, I thought that that was completely something that you had made up. It just is such a beautiful, I don't know, culmination of the story. It doesn't end the plot, obviously, but I thought that you had dreamt that up, and I actually Googled it to see whether it was true or not, because it just seemed to fit so seamlessly into your narrative. I thought it had to have come from your imagination.
Yeah, no, that it did actually happen. And that was the beginning of everything. And I hope we haven't given up too much away. I don't think we have, really.
I don't think so.
If you look up Saint-Exupéry, everybody knows he died at that point. So yeah, so that was the start. And then I couldn't tell you how all these different, well, I could tell you a little bit about how all these different things kind of came into being. But one thing that's great about when you're writing a book, you have this spark and then you've got this huge thing ahead of you and you don't know how you're going to get there. But as you start looking into it, it feels like some things come to light that just slot in so perfect and you can't believe it. You think, well, this is meant to be, but that's easy with hindsight. So I guess it's just what kind of sparks you.
I love that. So there were some hot and heavy love scenes in this book that I didn't remember from The Painter's Girl. What was it like to write those?
Oh God, it's the hardest thing in the world. And to be honest, I'm not sure I particularly enjoy writing it. I felt like in this particular instance, in the kind of theatre of war where everything is so intense and everything is heightened and nobody has enough time, nobody knows if they'll ever see each other again, that there is this kind of intensity about the relationships. And that's what I was trying to convey here.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it feels like if you hadn't written those scenes, it just would have gone unsaid. And why not say
it? Yes, and I did. And actually, in The Painter's Girl, there were a few. See, all of my books have got a few of those kinds of scenes, but I feel like that's part of the human condition as well. So I didn't want to just kind of gloss over that, but I don't dwell too much on it.
No, but I did read it and think like, ooh, this is a sexy scene.
Just hope my mum doesn't read it.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think it would be really lovely to hear a little bit from the book. Is there anything that we need to know before you read to us?
So this is a little bit along in the plot where we first meet Saint-Exupéry and where we meet Lilou, my protagonist, through his eyes. So I thought it was a good place to start because there's a certain amount of his descriptions of flying in there. And also we meet Lilou through his eyes.
Checking the position of the moon and with the fading star of Mintaka at his back, he bore down towards the coast. The map sat untouched on the rear seat. No need to consult it. He knew the Bay of San Rafael like the back of his hand, from happier times where he'd taken up wide-eyed passengers on hot summer days to swing around the bay and marvel at the sparkling expanse. The makeshift landing field the agent had described and pinpointed on the map he also knew. It was part of his sister's estate at Agay. The familiar clump of 3 umbrella pines just beyond the big house would be his guide if he flew low enough. The Estoril coast glowed red, even at this time of night. Antonio thought his heart would burst to see France again. 2 years in exile in New York, getting fat, hopelessly trying to shepherd his faithless, fragile and wayward wife from her worst excesses. And he still proudly didn't speak that infernal language English, even after all this time. Here he was, back in the homeland, where he was destined to be, in the air, defending his beloved France. He took a wide curve in. The Boche had anti-aircraft bristling along the entire coast, so he overflew Le Mouille, where he dropped a package of documents, hoping he'd been accurate enough not to wake up some unsuspected farmer with the package crashing through the terracotta roof, and doubled back to the Bay of Agay overland. Flying at 1,500 feet, it was easy to spot the L-shaped landing lights he was looking for, a makeshift affair of brave men holding torches on sticks, simple but effective. He flashed the code in Morse and prepared to land, coming in lower than he needed to over the umbrella pines, just to give the landing crew a bit of a jolt. That one always got hearts racing, and he liked to make an entrance. The responsive little ship bumped across the corn stubble and came to a halt just short of a stone shed that had placed itself presumptuously in the way of his trajectory. Nothing could faze him when he was in command of his cockpit, but the relief of being back in France nearly floored him as he stumbled out and onto the soil of the Var. The torch-bearers melted away into the night, and instead, out of the shadow stepped a girl who could only be a product of this exact place. Heavy arched eyebrows, dark soulful eyes, tanned skin and a face chiselled into stark beauty by poverty and hardship. A mountain girl, judging by her ruddy cheeks and untamed air. He was tall, over 6'2", and he was used to towering over nearly everyone he met, but this girl could give him a run for his money. She was only a few inches smaller than him, willowy and athletic where he was stout and stiff. She looked him up and down, surprised. It was a look that often greeted him when he stepped out of an aircraft. People expected the great aristocratic aviator and man of letters, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, to shimmy out of his cockpit in a dashing flying suit, a gust of wind catching his immaculate scarf as he climbed down. The truth was, he'd rolled out of bed in the late afternoon and dressed in haste, and the flying suits were always a little too small for his big frame. His receding hair was dishevelled, his socks didn't match, and let's face it, he was probably still wearing his pyjama top and hadn't noticed. A warm welcome to the man who fell to earth. She delivered the pre-planned greeting in a whisper, a suitably poetic choice for his return to France. Someone at the bureau had clearly read one of his books. He handed her a playing card from the deck he always carried. She fixed her intelligent eyes on his. "Ace of clubs," she said in a broad southern accent that filled him with nostalgia. "One is always the beginning of a mountain number. I think I'm right," he said. She handed it back. There was a self-possessed quality about her that made him feel safe. "That's classified information," she answered. "Quite right, soldier," he said. "Lead the way."
Thank you so much. So, will you be revisiting France in a future book?
Yes, I've already started writing book 4. I couldn't keep away from the place. So yes, it's set in France again, sort of England and France and other parts of Europe, but the majority of the action takes place in France. So yeah, so it continues. I never thought that I would end up writing 4 books set in France, but there's something about it. I just love it. I was in Paris recently and was reminded just what an amazing city it is.
Can you give us a hint as to what time period you're going to be venturing into?
It's a time slip novel. It's set in present day, and it's also set in France in 1942. So it's another World War II novel, and I'm terrible with figures. I've got this great big spreadsheet of when everything's happening and when it's all melding together, and I'm just wrestling with all of that at the moment. So that's coming out, I think, next in May 2025.
Wow. Okay. Very exciting. Well, I will look forward to that. I'm very interested to hear you writing present day.
That's what my publisher said to me. I don't regret it. I hope she doesn't regret it.
I'm sure not. You're a beautiful writer at any time period. Well, so where can people find you? How can they keep up to date with what you're doing and with all of your French-focused books?
So I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and I always love hearing from my readers. So you can find me there. I've also got a website, helenfrippauthor.co.uk. And there's a email form on there, so you can write to me that way.
Perfect. Well, I will include links to everything. Thank you so much, Helen. It was so wonderful seeing you again.
Thank you. And you too. Really lovely to chat.
Thank you again to Helen Fripp for such an interesting conversation. You can find Helen on Instagram at Helen Fripp Author, on Twitter at Helen Fripp, and on her website, helenfrippauthor.co.uk. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with award-winning author Katrina Kell about her novel, Chloe. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.